First off, I'm LaPera. I work for Kimley-Horn, and I've been doing, I sit on the board of the EMA. I've been doing commissioning. I think I was in the second class or the third class to get commissioning. I've been a commissioning agent for ACG since 2008, and I've been an energy management professional. I was in the second class of them since 2012. So, all those necessary things. Okay, so today we're going to talk about energy auditing, retro commissioning projects, why some exceed expectations and some not so much, right? I like to start every one of my presentations with a quote, and my buddy Al, I look like him every once in a while when I get up and my hair's kind of crazy. I'm not nearly as smart as him, right? I want you to think about something, about Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein in 1908, or it was 06 or 08, when he came up with the theory of relativity, right? E equals mc squared. I want you to just think about what I'm about to tell you. He came up with that concept all by himself. At that time, there were 6 people in the world that understood pieces of what he wrote on the theory of relativity. So think about how what one man thought up, it took 6 other people to understand pieces of it. So collectively, 6 people thought with one man. So he was so underrated on how brilliant he was. So anyway, but here, I like this one, learning from yesterday, live for today, hope for tomorrow. The important thing is to stop questioning, right? It has been kind of like the theme since we've been here, right? To talk about questioning all the things that are happening, you know, the way our energy, we have to start thinking about it, whether we want to or not, whether we think we're old fossils and we're not supposed to change, you know. We got to embrace change. Things has to happen, so I think that's important, but we have to find a way to get there. All right, I'm not necessarily going to read all the learning objectives if you need, but you know, under penalty of law, I had to put them in here, otherwise, you know, I would get in trouble. All right, so one of the things we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about energy audit basics, why some meet or exceed expectations and why some not so much. Why the successful ones succeed, and then starting with the end in mind, which you'll see what I mean about that. Communication is key, and then we'll ultimately end with lessons learned. You're gonna, at some point, you'll figure out that I have a theme for this whole thing at the moment, right? All right, so energy auditing, we'll just talk about an overview. You know, the secret ingredients of a successful audit is you got to understand your client. Because again, you know, that's who you're working for. They have their goals. They're not your goals. You can help tell them how they're going to achieve their goals. But it is not you that's going to dictate them, right? You got to find out what they are. And sometimes they don't know them, and you're going to help them. But again, at the end of the day, they're really their goals and not yours. You're going to give them a pathway of how do they get there from here. You're going to look at the opportunities, how you prioritize them, and how to prioritize the ECMs in them. And what I mean by that is that you can come up with a whole series of goals, but you got to look at them. Which ones you do first, which ones you do second, and why you do them that way. Sometimes it has to do with money. Sometimes it has to do with how it's going to be perceived. Sometimes you can't do C until you do B. Right? They're not, sometimes they go together. And then the last thing, everything is a team effort, and then there's the reality. Now you're understanding who's the client, so you got to build, the building owner is the decision maker, but you got to you're talking to the right person, because you could be talking to the corporate sustainability lead, you can have the corporate engineering lead, there's a corporate operations lead, there's a building manager, and then there's you, right? That you could be that person that are all part of help make all these decisions. Then there are other things, but per the Institute of Real Estate Management, it actually depends on who operates and owns the building, right? There's portfolio ownership and third-party ownership, and I'll talk about those in a second right here. But, you know, when you got to do it, you have to identify the critical, I apologize, I take some water here. When prioritizing, that's not a word I can say easily today, I don't know why. When prioritizing energy-saving opportunities, the following are critical. Like I already said a couple of minutes ago, that priorities shall be the building owner's priorities, direction, and desires, not yours. You can help them if they don't have any, if that's why they brought you in, to help come up with their ESG goals, to come up with their sustainability goals. If that's the case, that's great. But if they already have them, and I will tell you all, if you're going to go sit with a client, I just read a big article about this. The first 5 minutes, you can either win the client or lose the client, and you do it in the first 5 minutes. And the reason, and how that happens is if you walk in and you start talking about how great you are, you've probably lost them. If in the first 5 minutes you know all about them, what their goals are, what they're trying to achieve, then you've probably won that client, because there's no real reason for you to tell them how great you are. You're already sitting in the room. You got to think about that. So anyway, I'm just going to go, you know, when I talked about here is your guidance is important. That's the reason you're in the room, because they don't know how to get from somewhere. You got to think about it. There are corporate goals. Sometimes a REIT that owns a bunch of buildings have told somebody, you got to get to this particular goal, whether it's, we want to have, I work for a particular REIT that they said, and they wanted to go across their entire portfolio of buildings. They had 230 buildings or 300 buildings, and they wanted to achieve across their entire portfolio, they wanted to have 30% reduction on energy. Okay, well, you could say that's great, but if you understand anything about a REIT, they may not have that building 5 years from now. So talking about like no end in sight, it's just a circle. You don't know how you're ever going to get there. But the whole point, it was a great goal, and some buildings are real easy, and some buildings are real difficult. And anybody that sat through the course for the EMP, I told a story about how I had a building in San Francisco. Their EUI, if anybody, you all understand what an EUI is, of BTU per square foot, they were 15 BTU per square foot. They had an Energy Star score of 98. There isn't 30% I could get. The amount of money they would spend to try and achieve that energy savings was insane. It didn't make sense. So again, you got to understand what you're getting yourself involved in. And so now I want you to understand who your client is and who's the decision maker, right? There's portfolio ownership, right? And when you look at these, you want to go, whose responsibility to improve on day-to-day basis, right? And you look at some, and I can't read them this well. You know, that's what happens when you get old. You can't see as well as you thought you could. But for the most part, you know, when you look at them, it's the building manager and the building engineer. I wasn't supposed to do that. Okay, there we go. And then now the other one you get into is third-party services. When with the third party, if you don't understand what third-party service is, the building is owned by one person, right? Like the REIT, but now they bring in JLL, they bring in Cushman & Wakefield, Colliers, somebody else to operate their building. USAA is famous for doing that, which is really bizarre because they have JLL do one thing and then they have Cushman & Wakefield do something else in the same building. So talk about, I never could understand, there's multiple, but the whole point is, on those, who's responsible winds up becoming the building manager on the day-to-day, but the final decision is the asset manager. So again, Bob and I, Bob, who is my counterpart when we do the EMP workshop, he calls them the C-suite guys, I call them the suits. There's the person that you have to get involved to be able to come up and pay the bill, right? Who's going to pay the freight for this whole thing? And I've had people look at me and they goes, well, but if it makes sense, it doesn't matter what makes sense. The building engineer could tell that this is a great idea, we're going to save all this money. If the guy in the C-suite decides that it doesn't make sense, it doesn't happen. So you got to get everybody involved at the table, and you got to get all the stakeholders. Everybody has an important, including the tenants or the employees. There is as much as involved in a project to make it successful. All right, where are we here? Okay. All right, so now with the path forward. Now, how do we get there from here? We got to have effective and achievable ECMs. You got to reading the client's commitment to success. The client is the most important part of this. They have to be engaged. They have to want to make this happen. And you have to figure out what are their hot buttons. What is going to keep them from not going forward, or how you're going to keep them engaged so they keep funding the projects that need to be done. So you want to understand your client's staff strengths and weaknesses, right? And what do I mean by that? Strengths and weaknesses. Can some of the projects that you're going to come up with, can they be done by the staff in-house? Because that saves them some money, but it also takes them away from doing other things. So you got to understand all what they can do. And then a good rule to follow that I've always followed in almost all of my career is under-promise and over-perform. Always have. It can't fail. Like when I come up with audits, I always tell everybody, and I preach this, if I think any of my ECMs, and if nobody knows what an ECM is, an energy conservation measure, if I think I've calculated it's going to save $1, I tell the owner it's going to save 75 cents. And you say, well, aren't you confident in what you're doing? Yes, I'm very confident in what I'm doing. The difference is I still got human beings that are going to run this building after I'm gone. All I'm doing is implementing what I've come up with, and I'm relying on the building engineer to continue to do what we've implemented. And if anybody's here ever dealt with any building engineers, okay, well, when you deal with a building engineer, they name their chillers, right? They're like their children. And when Al comes in and says, we're going to start running this machine that they've been running now for the last 10 years at up to 80%, and then they start the other one, I'm telling him he's going to run it to 110%. They look at me like I'm talking about child abuse. No, you can laugh. But it's the truth. It is the God's honest truth. And then when you wind up doing this, if you don't get him on board, I've walked away from projects. The owner goes, Al, we want you to implement this. I said, no, sorry. And he goes, what do you mean sorry? Don't you want to work for me? I go, I'd love to work for you. I said, but Fred, I've talked to him. He's already told me I'm full of crap. He's cursed my lineage all the way back to my great-great-great-grandparents because of what I want to do with his chillers. So the minute I do all this, you're going to spend all this money, and the day we walk away, he's going to go back and operate them the way he's been operating them since the way he always has. And then who are you going to call? You're now going to call me up and curse out my lineage all the way back to my great-great-great-grandparents because I lied to you because you didn't earn all the savings that we thought I told you you were going to save. So, he didn't save 75 cents like I predicted. It cost him. He didn't save any money. Didn't matter. He didn't even save a quarter. So you get to a point that you have to understand who you're dealing with. So while, when you look at all of this, it's kind of like I said here, you're reading the tea leaves to understand all these things, right? There's no book. There is no, people tell you things, you have no idea, right? All right, so the path forward, you got to look at what are the right ingredients, right? You got to look at everything: HVAC, lighting, building envelope, and the education. Education is almost as important as anything else. And you go, what do you mean education? Well, I can tell you from I'll use a real simple one: daylight harvesting, right? It's a great idea. If there's enough light, it shuts the lights off, right? So you say, so what does that got to do with education? Okay, let me tell you, if you've been in an open office space and the first row of people along the window have those lights are out because there's a sufficient amount of light, guess who calls maintenance every single day to tell them that their lights are out? Those people, because they see their neighbor's lights adjacent are on. So they're thinking their lights are wrong, there's something wrong, could you come up and fix my lights? So it is an education to explain, so you have to get them involved in the whole thing. Another thing is that you got to understanding of building rating systems, certifications, since they can virtually demonstrate your client's commitment to sustainability, right? You got to find out, one of the things I'll do is I will go and I will read before I go meet the client, what are their sustainability goals? Okay, and if they're really big on that, well, I said, do you want to get a certification? And you say, you hear, right, we've all heard even today, some people build things LEED-like or, Green Globes-like or something like that. They don't get the certification, but they build like it. Some people get the certification, so when you come to their building, they proudly display it because it's important to them. They can go out to the community and say, I'm a good steward of the earth, right? So you got to understand, you got to read the tea leaves and to understand what they want. And always remember, an energized client is always your best advocate. I've had a client that, was like, he's an engineer, and he was my best client and he was my worst client. And what I mean by best and worst, he was my best because if I said we can do this, he challenged me to make it better. But then everything I turned in, he went through it. Al, you forgot apostrophe here. You sure this number's right? I came out and he took it to 3 more decimal points. And I'm going, okay, all right. Do you want to do it, dude? Is that what you want? But you got to love that person because he was so energized. And you'll see, I have a few slides about that particular project. Okay, and then the path forward success is always hinged upon understanding the kitchen that you're cooking in. I guess you've all figured out my theme for today, right? And what it is that you got to think about it. An office building, ECMs for an office building are going to be different than a retail store, and they're going to be different from retailers from residential and industrial. Well, that's different from everything else, whether it's a warehouse, whether it's a pharmaceutical plant, or anything like that. Now, you got to figure out the opportunities, right? The ECMs shall be ranked on the following: their feasibility, their cost, usually no cost, low cost, high cost. Then, you got to prioritize these ECMs in the payback analysis, and you got to rank them financially and organize them based on either a simple payback or an ROI, or unless it's an investment grade audit, right? And then they're going to borrow money. See, and that's something, when you do all this, you got to figure out from the very beginning who your client is. Are they sticking their hand in their own pocket, or are they going to go to the bank and borrow money? And you say, what difference does it make? Well, it makes a big difference. If they're funding it itself, there's no interest on the money. If they're going to the bank, there's interest on the money. And so now what you did as a simple payback or a simple ROI is no longer simple, because now you got to look at the cost of money, how long they're going to borrow it for, how they're going to get those funds. Are they going to, do like maybe a PACE loan? Now, if anybody understands a PACE loan is the only loan that when you, like, everybody here has maybe bought or sold a house, right? And what was the first thing you got to do? You have to satisfy, if you have a first and second mortgage, you have to pay both of them off before you can sell the house, right? Or as you sell the house. The same thing with commercial real estate. PACE loan is the only thing, because it's basically an energy loan, is the only one that could be transferred to the next ownership. It's the only one that could be done that way. And it's usually done because they've done upgrades to the building for like chillers and windows. Usually windows is the one that usually triggers that you want to go do the PACE loan, because now you got something that's going to be a 10 or a 15-year payback. So you've gotten a 20-year loan or a 15-year loan. And then when you get into those, you've got to look at the net positive, net present value. And then, then all of them are ranked on the shortest ROI to the longest ROI. Most of the time. I've done projects that had a very short ROI with a big bang for the buck, meaning that I'm going to tell you what one of them are is like changing lighting in a garage. That's a simple one, right? Sometimes I have the owner go, I don't want to do that one. I said, but you're going to save the most amount of energy and it's the least amount of cost. It's not sexy. It's not something they can go, oh, gee, I saved lights in my garage, or I did this to make my building for all my tenants better. It's an easier sell. So you got to understand, even though sometimes certain things make sense, again, reading the room, understanding your client and what are their goals of how they want to get there. And now, the other thing that there are opportunities you got to think about that are non-energy benefits, right? And what are those? You got to think about how if you have a current, let's say, metal halide lighting, you have T12 or T8 or T5 lamps that you got to replace every so often, you now have manpower that has to be accounted for. Right? The staff is going to spend so many hours to do that. That's a real cost that helps in calculating the savings and calculating the payback period. So those are things like that. And then there are the other intangible ones. I always talk about there's the $3, $30, and the $300 rule. $3 is what energy costs us. $3 a square foot is energy. $30 a square foot is rent. And it's probably a little bit higher, but in general. And then it's $300 is salaries. And if you start to look at it, you say like, Al, what are you talking about? Improved lighting. Well, there is a color rendering index on all lighting. And if a color rendering index is less than 78, you working in that environment, you won't know it, but you may go home every night with a headache. And so that makes you less productive, gives you more sick days. So by changing those light bulbs to something 78 and greater, productivity goes up, you have better tenants, everybody, they're workers. So where did you have the most effect? On that $300 a square foot, right? If you can change that by 10%, you've done a lot. If I've saved energy by 10%, I've saved 30 cents. If I've saved it on the rent, I've saved $3. I've improved it by $30. So I'm just saying everything is kind of relative. So that's where some of the benefits. No, you can't. No. You can't put it in, but you have to talk about it because it's a true reality. But but they will know. They will understand because you will have asked the question, hey, do you have an inordinate amount of sick leave? Do people go home early? Are they been complaining of headaches? You ask some of these telltale questions. It rarely happens, but sometimes you find it. Another thing you find is that you get people like, this used to happen a lot in New York, where the office buildings, right? You come in the morning, it's dark. You go home, it's dark. and they work in the bowels of the building, and they never see daylight. Well, to help those people, their circadian rhythm gets completely screwed up. They have no idea what time of day it is. So you can go ahead and you can change the lighting in where they're working during the day. Because everybody doesn't know this, the sun is bluer in the morning and more orange in the afternoon. So you can have your lights bluer, and then as the day goes on, you gradually change them till they're more orange. So when they go out, you've kept their circadian rhythm up. Makes them better. I read an article about in Alaska, right? We all know this, like, was it 6 months of almost constant daylight and sitting minds, well, it plays on people's minds. That they say that there's certain things that you would get arrested for in any other place in the country, you don't get arrested for it in Alaska. Because they know that your brain is messed up because of this is what happened. I mean, I read that, it was like literally from one of those scientific magazines that I read that on. It was like a 40-page article, and I go, wow. It's like you would never think about it, but it has that kind of impact on people. So, but it's a team effort to get everything done. I got to tell you that. If you think you're going to get it done by yourself, you're going to fail. You're destined to fail. You got to get everybody involved. And you got to understand the goals for the guys in the seats. You got to, all the stakeholders have something to say. I will caution you on getting all the stakeholders. Bob, my counterpart, was telling a story while we were doing our workshop, which I thought was great. Everybody knows what an OPR is, right? And you try to get all the stakeholders in, and normally you get like 10, 15 people. So he was doing a project at a university, and he wanted all the stakeholders. 150 people showed up because all the students that they're putting some money into the student union, so so talk about a nightmare. You're lucky you can get 10 people to come up with the way to do something. Imagine a bunch of kids that read nothing but sound bites of what's on. No, I mean, seriously, we all have to address that people talk about sound bites, right? They talk about how we're supposed to. Solar energy is the wave of the future. Okay, does anybody in this room have any idea in 2021 what the percentage of solar production for the entire United States was? 2.9%. So renewables are great, but they're not going to get us there. Not yet, not now. They will eventually. I mean, I have no doubt we have the greatest minds in this country that are going to figure it out, but I'm saying we're not there yet. But if you listen to some of these kids come in, because that's all they're hearing is solar, 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 or wind. Well, if you live in Florida, wind doesn't work real well. Right? And if you're in Florida, you want to do geothermal, because obviously I'm in Florida now, but you go and you do geothermal. It doesn't really work well in Florida because the groundwater temperature is, depending on where you are, is between 72 and 75 or a little bit warmer, and it's constantly getting warmer. Doesn't make sense. If you're down in Miami, it's almost 80 degrees. So, so again, everything is relative to where you are and what you're doing. So at least understand it. The other thing is I told that story already about, especially you want to need the backing and the support of the faculty engineering staff, right? I told you the whole story about the child abuse and the chiller. You need them because they are going to be your advocate after you leave. So, and they also will tell you where all the bodies are buried. When you're walking the site with them, they'll tell you what's not been maintained and why it wasn't maintained and why they've been doing this and why they've been doing that. Okay. What's the reality? Are all ECMs ever unsuccessful? Yep. All too often, ECMs do not achieve their fully projected impact. On average, retrocommissioning projects achieve their projected goal fail to underachieve their projected goals by a factor of 2. That's how bad it is sometimes. Many times, the strategies for choosing ECMs contribute to their failure. One of the other things you got to look at is energy audits are sometimes unreliable in their bias. And you say, why? Because they don't evaluate all the possible improvements. They short-cutting building analysis. I can give you a real simple one. If you're in the Northeast, and you come in and you've had, and I'm going to go to the extreme example of going with T12 lamps. All right? Those used to generate about 2 watts a square foot of lighting, which also meant 2 watts a square foot of heating. So you go in and you change something that's 2 watts a square foot to something that's now 0.6 watts a square foot, and you say you're going to save all this energy. And you're right, you're going to save all that energy. But you're in the Northeast, and all of a sudden, what happens in the Northeast when you hit around September? It starts to get really cold. And the heat has to come on. Well, you now have to either do fossil fuel or electricity or, of something to be able to make up for that heat that you no longer have. So sometimes somebody didn't think about all those synergies when they thought about all their ECMs that they have to think about. It's really important when you do that. They don't look at, like I said, ECMs holistically, and they do. Unfortunately, they always have an HVAC and a lighting slant. And you go, Al, what do you mean by that? Well, you're forgetting about, I don't have the slide in here, but if you ever look at a building, how much the energy, if you go through where the energy goes in a building, whether it's lighting, the envelope, plug loads, etc., the envelope has the largest amount of impact. So the better the envelope is, the better off you are. So now, if you've done your whole audit and you've ignored the building, and it leaks like a sieve, and I always use the example of, everybody here know what a jalousie window is? Right? If you don't know what a jalousie window is, they are windows that are on slants like this. And so air comes in, the building leaks like a sieve. Well, you can put in, like I always have people ask me, I always have friends that ask me, hey, I'm putting in a new air conditioning unit, blah, blah, blah. Can I raise my set points? I want to save some energy. First question I ask, I said, what kind of windows do you have? And they go, jalousie. No. Because you have such an infusion of air, it'll never work. So the point is, you got to think about, you got to understand the building. If you're walking around and you see that you can drive a Mack truck underneath the doorway to the outside, because I've been in garages in basements of buildings where there's like a gap that much under the bottom of the door. And they wonder why they're growing geopets on the walls and they got other things happening on that floor because of it. So again, everything has an impact that you have to think about. And one of the other things is usually the most egregious thing is that you overestimate the ECM savings. You remember I said if I calculated $1, I only tell them 75 cents. Most people put the $1 in because I believe that they're going to save the $1, but I don't know that. I'm still going to have a human being that's going to operate this building. And then the other thing is you underestimate the construction cost. Everybody gets, when they look at the number, because they know, everybody that does audits, they know that the rules of thumb are if the payback period, simple payback, is 3 to 5 years, the owner's going to do it. It goes beyond 5 years to 7, they think about it, and maybe they'll do it. Gets beyond 7 years, forget about it, right? And that keeps going further down. So now you go do your number, you come up with your energy savings that you went down to 75 cents, and you went to the construction costs and you've done your best due diligence of what you can, And all of a sudden, it's 5.7 years. Well, you know, if you went back to the dollar, it makes it underneath. It's like preservation. You want the project, you want it to go, but if you keep doing that, and you did that on every single one of your things, and you know what happens. Murphy is the most efficient human being I've ever met. He screws everything up. And, you know, so the minute you did all that, next thing you know, you failed, nothing's happened. So that's one of the major reasons that people don't address the construction cost right. Right? They guessed, anybody here involved in construction a little bit, right? So everybody know what's gone on for the last couple of years, supply chain issues, where you couldn't get a price to last more than a week. Some of them wouldn't, if you called them the next day, they would tell you the price went up. I mean, I'm not joking about it. I'm not exaggerating. I've known people where they got a price today. If they didn't sign the ticket today, it went up tomorrow. So if you did that, and usually when I get all that, I go, hey, there's always a disclaimer. Things in my mirror are closer than you really think they are. I have no idea. This is based on the price today. I've had people have audits, and they did them like a year ago, and they come back and they go, hey, we want to do this now. I go, yeah, you could forget about whatever that number was. I have no idea if it works. It's just a reality. And then, however, the most important part of the plan has to be communication, transparency, communication, a course of action, communication, diligence, communication. If you haven't figured out, communication is really a key in this whole deal, right? And the reason why I'm saying that, you have to understand, because your owner, right, they have to be able to go and tell their stakeholders, whoever they are. It could be their employees, that why they're going to be uncomfortable for a couple of days or a week or whatever. So you got to get everybody, and they have to tell them things. And they might be going out and telling the community of what they're doing. So it's really important that communication is really key. He's talking about, whole building energy savings, right? So you got to start with the end in mind. I love that statement. I've been using that for probably about 10 years maybe, because it's very true. You got to think about, where do you want to go when you get started? So you got to have the owner's buy-in. You have to have a clear direction and path. You got to have really reasonable expectations, right? You can't sell somebody a bill of goods that you can't deliver on. Don't write checks your body can't cash. It doesn't work that way. You want, again, full communication and teamwork. You want everybody to be part of the team. All right, and then you got to look at things holistically. You got to predict your energy savings conservatively, right? You heard me talk about that. Even if it's not the right number, but you're better off telling them that. And if it comes in better, all the good. Let them make the decision. It's better than them coming to you and go, wait a minute, you said I was going to be this. You're not even close. How did, and then your credibility is shot. Because at the end of the day, all you have is your ethics and your credibility. That's all you're selling for someone. And if you don't think that person is not going to call their buddy that's the CEO of the company across the street that's seeing what he's or she's doing here to see how you did, and the first thing they say, well, they lied. It doesn't really work. And you want to keep the owner always in the loop. Okay, but when the recipe is really developed, so you got building, retro-commissioning, you got control, sequence, implementation, lighting upgrades, CEP, the magic happens. It really does. And then you wind up having, you start to see here what really happens. You start seeing regularity. Things are operating the way you intended them to operate when you go back and you do some trending. And then you go over here, the results, they're outstanding, right? You look at this. Now, what you're going to see here, this is a project I actually did. And you could see what I had promised them, which was that red line going across. And the black line was the goal of where we started. That was without doing any of the ECMs. Now, you could tell that I got the projected usage almost with the start of the ECMs, almost got them to the promised land, right? But all the other things. Now, you can see the last two lines at the way at the bottom, those were outliers, and I've completely ignored them. I put them in. Why have I ignored them? That was during COVID. The building, people weren't in there. You know, you can't use them. You can, it's nice. I could say, oh, look how much more energy you saved there. But, you know, let's be real about what that was, right? And I always tell everybody when they take my class, I said, when you set up metrics, make sure you set up metrics on anything but money. Anything but money. Yes, you use money to illustrate how much money they're going to save, but think about it. If you worked with somebody and you predicted it based on 10 cents a kilowatt, and then when you're done, they're at 6 cents a kilowatt, the money doesn't work. Or conversely, it went to 16 cents a kilowatt. Now it looks like you didn't do anything. While the energy savings is all there, financially it didn't. But when I come back to you, I go, wait, hold it, let's go back and look. Can I look at these lines here? Is that did I get you where I promised you? The answer has to be yes. At the end of the day, that is where the proof is in the pudding, because I told them these is the amount of energy that we're going to save. And just so you know, on this particular project, which is going to, I'll show you the next one, here, this is the money, right? This is truly the money. They went from, the KWH here was really high to really low. And so basically within a couple of years, because I had told them initially in 2016, I told this one client, if you follow the promised land, you follow the recipe that I'm giving you, your electric bill is going to go from $550,000 a year to $235,000. It got down to like 222 or something like that. So the whole point is it can happen, but you're going to see, and here's another one. This is talking about, these were the electric costs, right? You could see here. And you can see literally in the first year the energy cost. But I'm going to show you something else here. Remember, I just talked about the cost of energy. You can see over those years their energy costs, how that happened in this day and age, that they went from 9 cents down to 6 cents. I mean, they didn't tell me this. They gave me their electric bills. So the whole point is that, if you go back to this, some of that cost, they got there because of, I did some good things, but they got their money savings in the first year, but part of it is because of the reduced energy cost. So does everybody understand why I'm saying that don't do it based on it? Here it worked out great. I mean, I could have been, walking in high grass. This was beautiful. No, I would look at the energy, and the energy wasn't right. We weren't there. I didn't expect it to be there because they didn't do all the ECMs yet. And when we did, that's what proved to me that my thought process, my engineering, my team's work was valid. And then, lessons, successes and the lessons learned, developing a workable plan that all parties have a vested interest in always having a positive outcome. All invested enthusiast owner is key to a project's success. Firmly believe in the project's initial design. I put in here something on I carry over. I did a project for a university. And that was that was a leftover. I meant to change that, but that was a leftover of one of the reasons that the project was a success during COVID. They did not have as much with students getting sick, and the reason why is that they had a displacement ventilation. I had already designed that university building almost 6 years prior, and it happens to be in the state of Florida, one of the largest displacement ventilation systems in the state. So I came up with this idea to do it. I thought it was a great idea. It was mainly because of the architecture, because the architect didn't want to see diffusers and he didn't want to see that, so I came up with this really neat concept. But the point I'm driving at here is that there's reasons why things are successful. And that was one of the reasons on that one. And then you need to have a dedicated team member to achieve a positive outcome, meaning that you got to have one person from each thing. Like if they have they're going to go out to the community and tell everybody, well, you're the one that's going to feed them all the information, but you're not going to hand it to the guy in the C-suite. He's not going to do it. He has a multimedia person that you're going to work with, or you're going to work with the head of maintenance, or you're going to work, you got to figure out who all the stakeholders are, but make sure they only have one voice. They're okay if they fight amongst themselves, but when they come to you, it's one voice. And with that, I will take some questions. Hello? Yes.
So when you're doing your analysis,
yeah,
when you've got your kilowatt, your cost per kilowatt hour and all that stuff, the last one I did, we had a really tough time, figuring out the impact of your peak kilowatt charges on your electric bill, and just exactly how that affects the payback, the cost savings of the energy measures. How do you deal with that?
So you're talking about demand limiting. Okay, so again, the first thing on that one, you should have looked at what kind of rate structure they were using. Did it make sense to change the rate structure from what they're doing to something else? I'm going to answer your question in a second, but that's the first thing you should have done. And let's say you figured out, no, that is still the right rate structure that they should be on. Well, now you have to now look at, okay, why is it peaking? What is peaking? And how do you limit it? And I could tell you, because I do a lot of thermal storage systems, and one of the things that they get hit is demand charges, and you got to figure that out. Well, what you wind up doing is, what would happen is a chiller that would start up when it shouldn't, right? And you're saying, like, what do you mean by that? Well, you have two chillers. You get to 4:30. Everybody goes home at 5, more or less. You get to 4:30, 4:40, and you've hit the max peak of that chiller. And ideally, you start the next chiller. Well, guess what happens when you start that chiller? You've hit this demand charge. You've added it. So now you go, you know what? You know what we're going to do? Because you've now looked at the trending and you know that this is what's going on and you know that that's your problem. You can go ahead and say, you know what? At that point, we're going to reset the chill water temperature up a degree, or we're going to hold off, because normally think about it, a lot of times you'll go into a 15-minute countdown before you start the next one. You may want to make it, and think about it, that 15 minutes may get you in still just before 5 o'clock. So you may want to make it a half hour. Again, you may ultimately abandon that because you have complaints, depending on when it happens. But for the most part, that's the way you got to look at what's causing that peak. And if you have enough trending, you can figure out what the peak is. And hopefully like one of the things that you could maybe have done is that you've seen that they are primary, secondary pumping on their chill water. And you're going to convert it to variable flow primary. I use that as a basis. I could tell you an example. I won't say what airport it was. We had 10 years, not 1 year, not 2 years, 10 years of trended data on their existing plant to feed their landside building that they never went under 800 tons. Never. Not once. We put this new variable flow primary plant in. Didn't change anything in the land side at all. That first year it was running, winter time, where obviously it would be the low load during the middle of the night, we couldn't keep the chiller on because the load went down to 160 tons. So you may have false loads that you're not seeing until you change it. So your problem may go away. Anybody else got any questions? Yes, sir.
General question. I saw on your slide a lot of emphasis on KWH, but shouldn't you do it in the BTUs rather than KWH, especially if you have a lot of other sources of energy that you're working with?
Well, you got to, but you got to understand, if you wind up doing a benchmark on the building, you got to get it to kBTU per square foot. So you got to convert everything, whether it's therms, gas, or gallons of diesel fuel. You got to get it all to one. Think about when we were all back in school, for me, a long time ago, back in school, that you had to remember get all your common denominator. So that's the reason. You get it all to kW. And admittedly, most buildings are almost all electric anyway, so that answer your question?
Kind of, yeah. So my second question is, you mentioned that the recommendation of yours is that if the chiller goes to 50%, you want them to take it all the way to 100% basically running. And I understand that's probably peak efficiency over there, and then you want them to...
Well, no, see, it's a little bit different. The old way of thinking was chillers, you took them to 80%. When you got to 80%, you started the second machine. Well, guess what? Now you have two machines at 40% that are probably in the worst spot on their compressor cycle, on the map of the compressor. Their kW per ton is not right. So if you took it to 110, when the second one came on, you were above 50%. That's the whole rationale. The problem is sometimes you get, and I'm not picking on anybody in particular, whether you get Johnson Controls, Siemens, Trane, Honeywell, they all have some black box that tells you they can do all this and they're going to optimize your building. Well, I talked to one particular one, which I won't name, not because they did anything wrong, and they said, well, we're going to reset your condensed water temperature. I'm going, you're going to do what? I said, when are you going to do this? In the middle of the winter? He goes, no, we do it whenever it makes sense, and we'll adjust your chill water temperature up. I go, could you do this to me in the summer? Oh yeah, we see it all the time. Where? In North Dakota? We're in Tampa, Florida, my friend. I said, no, I guess what? Keep your black box. We're not doing that sequencing at all. Because they couldn't tell me how they were making it happen. I don't like something, you stick something in, and it kind of makes up, I'm sorry, I'm old school. But that's the way I am. Anybody else have any questions?
Third question.
Sure.
So, what do you think came first? Energy management, sustainability, or retro commissioning?
Okay. What came first? This is like the chicken or the egg. Sustainability has been around about 20 years. You said retro commissioning, energy management.
Yes, sir.
Well, I think energy management, sustainability came around, like I said, 20 years. Retro commissioning came as part of all, they all kind of came off each other. So I'll say, I may not be right, I will say sustainability is what LEED, for whether you like them or you don't like them, they started this ball rolling completely, right? Which I think is great. The only thing that I thought was interesting, if anybody's familiar with LEED, they said it was supposed to be around for X period of time and then go away once they would get it into the codes. Well, all the codes are very efficient. LEED didn't go away. Nothing that makes money ever goes away. They just morph it into something else. Now, the one thing that you will see that I didn't talk about in here is that the next thing that you'll start to see, and COVID kind of made it happen or brought to the forefront, is health and wellness within the buildings. Like everybody here familiar with the well building standard? Okay, well, if you're not, what the well building standard is, if you understand what LEED was to the building itself, energy and construction of the building, the well building standard or fit well is to the occupancy of the occupants of the building. It talks about air quality, water quality, lighting quality, right? So it's really it made a big difference. Yes, sir.
So I have a difference of opinion over there, and I think most of you are correct, but energy management came in first. Derivatives were sustainability and retro-commissioning, and in reality, most of the retro-commissioning measures are ECM, they used to be ECM measures in the old energy audits, and they just converted into a retro-commissioning process. So the energy management was after the oil embargo, with a lot of push on there. And
yes, you're right. I forgot all about. No, I have to agree. The young man there is correct. It's true, because I lived through that. And I'll tell you one quick story. I may not have enough time. I'll tell you a real quick story. One of the guys I worked with at LaPera Associates, brilliant engineer, and cost of oil and gas and everything got crazy, and your electric bill was nuts at this time. We're talking about, late 70s, early 80s. And he caulked his house up, weather stripped, this and that and the other. He had to open his window to close the door because the house was so tight he couldn't close the door. All right, so you can, and again, to me, that is the worst thing you can do. I'm a firm believer that a building needs to breathe. You have to. That's how you get, you flush things in and out of your house. But you're right. That's where it first came. That's when they started. We went from years ago. Nobody cared about how much outside air you brought into the building. The more, the better. Let's do. It was like, Las Vegas dollars. Anything you want, we can do it. And then it started to cost a lot of money, and they started cutting down, and they went to this really low outside air per CFM per person. Right? We went from almost whatever it was, 20, 30 CFM per person down to 5. Guess what happened? We got sick buildings because you had too high of a CO2 levels and all sorts of things that started to happen in the buildings. Anything else?
A general comment on the CO2 level. Last month, in the submarines, the CO2 levels are in 20,000 or 30,000 range, basically, and they're on numerous submarines and they're performing pretty well. So the general discussion over here normally, if 1,500 CFM or 2,000 CFM, productivity goes down and so forth, basically. What are your thoughts on that?
My personal thoughts? This is me, the outside air police are going to probably come get me at some point for this, is that I think a lot of the things about CO2 levels, you're right, I didn't realize they went that high. I thought submarines only got as high as 5,000. But the whole point is, and if you think about fighter jets, they only get a small amount of oxygen, and they do really complicated things that have to happen on, so I think that a lot of it has to do certain government agencies overstepping their bounds. This is just Al's opinion. I'm not speaking for the EMA, I'm not speaking for ACG, not speaking for anyone. This is Al. That I still comply with all the rules, but I believe that this is, somebody thinks it's that, a bunch of people in a room said, you know what, you can't be more than 700 parts per million above ambient. It's kind of the idea, and that's my personal thing. I may be so totally off, but the reason I do all that, I remember when I first started doing smoke control in buildings, and I thought for some reason that, there's these geniuses somewhere that came out in the code and they said, you're going to do so many air changes, right? And so I remember asking, I had the guys that, I went to a seminar, and the guys that wrote it were in the room. And I said, how did you get the 6 air changes an hour? He goes, oh, well, that side of the room wanted 4, and that side of the room wanted 8, and we settled on 6. I go, you're kidding me, right? You really didn't tell me that, right? He goes, no, I'm serious. I'm really serious. I go, okay. So I was like, my brain was blown on that whole thing. It's like, I don't get it. I don't understand. But it's okay, you know, you live and you learn, and you realize that, you know, the world is, and actually it made me feel better later on that there's a compromise. Well, it doesn't work that way now. You got to prove the calculations, you know, do all the stuff based on the fire size and so on. Any more questions? All right, well, I hope everybody enjoyed this. I hope I was not boring for anybody. I know that after this, I'm supposed to tell you, nobody told me to do this, but I'm going to tell you, we're supposed to go next door, and there's all go see all the vendors that have been here, and, right, Jim, right? Jim is the reason I'm involved here.